Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to this third podcast from the Center of Intra-Muslim Studies, CIMS, from the Al-Mahdi Institute. Third in this series in which I'm again joined by Professor Iman Abdul Hadi from the University of Chicago, sociologist there, Sheikh Hassan Rabbani from Glasgow, who works as a chaplain at Heriot-Watt University and also has a fantastic scholarly background from Al-Azhar, and Dr. Shaban Amir from the American Islamic College, who's an anthropologist there, also from Chicago. And in this particular episode, we're trying to unpack types of abuse that take place in Muslim societies. Of course, no community, and no religious community particularly, is immune from spiritual abuse. However, in every society it has its own inflection, how it takes place. And so we're discussing it from a Muslim context particularly. When you're talking about abuse, spiritual abuse, sexual abuse, of course it's a very emotive topic. And it's very difficult to talk to divorce the emotion from that and talk about it in a very intellectual and notional fashion. But I'm going to ask you to do that, first of all, Iman. Because we know when talking about abuse in Muslim societies, of course there are invested parties out there who would want to over-amplify and overemphasize the instances of abuse that do take place in Muslim societies in order to criticize those Muslim communities. On the other hand, if we don't speak about them, of course, many issues of abuse and instances of abuse are brushed under the carpet and then we cannot deal with them. So as Muslims, where can we draw that balance in how to address these issues?
Well, first of all, this type of abuse is neither unique to nor inherent to Muslim communities. It is in every community. But I think we as Muslims can't always be operating from a space of reaction where we're constantly thinking, what's the outside world going to think of us or what are they going to do to us? We have to act in accordance to our values and our responsibilities to each other and to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we need to ask ourselves, how do we build healthy communities that protect Muslims, that are safe spaces for Muslims, and that especially protect the most vulnerable amongst us? At the end of the day, I think we are going to be asked about that. And we won't be able to have a future as a community in the immediate sense if we're not able to address these issues. So I think we have to just keep on keeping on and trust that by being, by taking care of these situations, we are going to have stronger, healthier communities that are better able to meet the challenge of Islamophobia and outside pressure.
Shawana, in Chicago, have you met instances whereby the Muslim communities there have been challenged in how to draw this balance between, well, if we let the outside world know about what's going on, it's going to affect us in a negative way. The Islamophobes are out there ready to get us. And if not, of course, then we live with the guilt of the victims of this abuse.
Absolutely, we have. And not too long ago in Chicago, there was a pretty prominent Quran teacher, and he was associated with a strong network. He was basically strongly connected with a lot of the Islamic community in Chicago. So, he was not royalty, but you know what I mean, like Islamically a prominent family. And he was guilty of molesting a number of girls while teaching them Quran. Now you can just imagine the sort of damage that does to a person, that while your relationship with the Quran is so impacted by abuse. And then after that, when you pluck up the courage to go to your parents, to family, to community, then they say, nobody will believe you. This is a well-respected person. Nobody will believe you. You should be quiet. We don't believe you. How could this be true? What were you wearing? What did you do? The usual things, right? So you can imagine the layers of harm that those people experienced coming forward. And this divided the community very much between people who centered the abuse survivors and people who dug in their heels and said, we will not engage in this mudslinging, right? And we need to protect our own, right? Because we live in an Islamophobic world. Of course, we live in an Islamophobic world. We live in an Islamophobic country, which benefits from, the state benefits from the smearing Muslims as being uniquely abusive of girls and women, right? So, and this is actually something that Dr. Mattson also spoke yesterday and said, will it be used if we raise the issue? Will it be used by Islamophobes? Of course, likely. Yes, it will be. Of course it will be. But what does that mean for us? The Quranic pronouncement still stands of Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, stand in justice, right? Stand with justice against even your own souls, even your own people, even your own parents, for the sake of justice. So that doesn't go away, no matter what the dangers, right? So we still, like you said, we still have to be true to our own values and not let that defensive kind of which I understand also it's so hard, right? Being a Muslim minority, it is very difficult to be constantly stereotyped as being harmful to women and girls, etc. But it's hard. This is the world. It's not Jannah, right? This is the world. These are the struggles we have to face.
Sheikh, as people working in pastoral care, either yourself or your colleagues must have been at some point on the front line of receiving people who are in need of your help, having faced or having been victims of some sort of abuse. How did you manage to tackle that in those circumstances? Or how did you manage to help the people who came to you or your colleagues if they've experienced that?
Yeah, this is, I suppose, a very heavy topic, and it's really heavy on the heart in particular. When we talk about Islam as a very beautiful religion, and then obviously the ugliness of people really shows. I'd just like to maybe share Maria's very prominent in Scotland and her work in Sacred, in particular looking at people who have been abused in a religious setting. And how they help them. And she has some very horrific stories, girls young as 6 or 7 coming who have been sadly molested by their Quran teachers. And looking at those cases with her, she's had a lot of struggle. I think the problem is that the imams, certain imams, yield a lot of influence in the community to the point where even when they're caught out, there's something about the community that is still willing to hide and support the imam and make the victim feel as if they're committing a big crime, talking about their sin against a religious authority. And I think for the victim, having that abuse, I suppose losing the connection with religion inevitably, but then made to feel bad about speaking about it, I think that's very, very difficult to actually deal with. And we talked about now there's work being done on Quran therapy, Quran trauma therapy. How do you bring these people back? Connection with the Quran, where the Quran now in past has been a trigger actually for them. So it's very, very difficult. And I think difficult for me because as an imam, I just feel then the whole fraternity maybe is targeted, in its entirety, and that's very saddening. And a lot of questions that I have is why is an imam teaching young boys and girls, in particular young girls, where is the safeguarding element actually in that? Why is it that we put so much trust in the imams and sheikhs? They are humans after all. I mean, they have desire. We had the fiqh books talking about imams shouldn't be in seclusion with young boys who have no hair on their chin. The fiqh was very harsh actually on this. Now you understand why the fiqh takes a very strong approach because of the door of actual abuse. So yeah, and we've had stories in Glasgow in particular of sexual abuse. I think moving from that, I think one thing that's I have been challenged with personally is where imams have married their students while studying. So there was a story of a prominent imam in Manchester who's in his 60s, married a student who was 17. And I know of people, imams, who have met their spouses through teaching an Islamic studies program. Now, I don't know how to process that. Is that abuse or is that not? They're in a position of power. My wife is a GP. She finds this very difficult because as dealing with a patient, there are those social decorums or boundaries, and she feels that the boundaries with an imam and when he's teaching in these informal settings, that the boundaries are really blurred. And she would question that. How can, as an imam, marry even the student's an adult, but for her, even that's kind of abuse.
So, I mean, this.
Can I jump in there?
Sure.
And because I recently heard a story, and this is obviously not abuse, but a story of a very famous scholar who leads a lot of people, and who also in his 70s, and who has married a second wife who is, very young, and has children that are, again, abroad. So he visits. I find this very... Okay, so it's all halal, obviously, right? So according to the technical fiqh, everything is halal there, right? But that fiqh then leaves open the ethical dimension of, why is this okay? I personally look at a person in his 70s and he's going to find somebody who's very young, abroad, visiting as a spouse. I would find it very difficult to relate to that person, period, let alone as a sheikh. You know what I mean? Like, I would just find it very difficult to relate to that person. And so I feel like very often, like, the fiqhi dimension, like, loses something that should be added. But obviously it's not abuse. So I feel like we need to maybe open the discussion further beyond what is technically abuse to, like, something broader. And what you're talking about is power, right?
Yes.
What you're talking about very much is power.
Abuse can only take place, of course, when there's that power dynamic in play. And the instance that Sheikh you've spoken about with the teacher who was aged, and the instance you've spoken about, technically abuse or not, and of course in terms of the jurisprudence, it's completely allowable. Right. Question here then, the problem we have, and the victim's inability to come forward is compounded by this as well, that power dynamic, is the pedestalization of religious figures. How do we do away with that in order to prevent abuse by breaking that power disparity?
Yeah, I think we need to stop looking for infallible leaders, and we need to stop treating our leaders as though they are infallible. The Nubuwwah did end with the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. We don't have any infallible figures in our community. And so I think it's exactly like my brother said, like, you need to have safeguards in the community, right, that protect against people's worst instincts, right? Like, don't have these secluded, things, but also to be able to say, a person could have benefited our community, could have done some good things, and still not be worthy of this position of power, right? Or not be able to hold it in a way that they won't abuse it. I think the other thing is we need to think about how to take on, how to look within our tradition for alternative forms of justice. Because I think part of the reaction people are having is many of us rightly don't trust the institutions that exist in the broader society to deal with these things, right? We don't trust the state. We don't trust law enforcement. And many of these institutions we know, at least I know from like gender studies, right, actually are very harmful in their own right, and are actually don't protect victims, and actually don't, and so I think for me, there is actually a lot in the Islamic tradition of what some might call transformative or restorative justice, right? So Sister Matson yesterday, Dr. Matson talked about the story of Sayyidina Yusuf, and I thought that was really powerful. The idea that here was an example of an asymmetry of power between Sayyidina Yusuf and his brothers, right? And systematic, sustained abuse over time, a cover-up story, right? And yet there was, at the end of the story, a moment of reconciliation, right? But that reconciliation, as she pointed out, and I'm really quoting here, as she pointed out, could only happen once there was an acknowledgement of the harm that was done, a public acknowledgement, and a public process, effectively, of coming to justice. What does that look like? Where can we go in our? It's already right there in the Quran, right? But where else can we go in our tradition? What other examples from the seerah, from the early community, can we look at to draw out a different form of justice within our communities? I think people are afraid of the carcerality of the state, and they're afraid of the disposability, of the sort of like canceling. I don't think that that's what we should replace. I don't think that we should take on those approaches either, right? But we can come up with our own community approaches that honor our tradition and honor survivors, right? And attempt to reach a place of kind of reconciliation. But that would mean, having systems in place to prevent this abuse, right? Having space in our communities to talk about what does abuse look like, how do we recognize it, right? And to talk about a transformative restorative justice process that gets us to the other side when abuse inevitably happens, because it's always going to happen. It's always happening around us.
You cited Professor Ingrid Mattson yesterday, and her fantastic Hulma project, which she's working on. And she cited, of course, that verse of the Quran and the story of Nabi Yusuf. And the Quran itself says, of course, that in him and his brother are signs for those who question. Okay, fine. So she brought that instance up about the restorative justice, and what she mentioned at the end were the brothers who were really guilty of attempted murder, if you like. And what was necessary for them was to come out publicly and say, look, we're sorry, we did it. And then, of course, the story, as we know, Yusuf, salamullahi alayhi, turns around and says, well, today there's no repercussions on you. Okay, but I'm going to shift from this side of the table to this side of the table and ask, right, but in reality, for those who have perpetrated sexual abuse, do we see that really happening? You know what, I'm going to put my hands up and I did this and that for there to be restorative justice? I don't think so. How does that happen in 2024 in the Western world?
Can I pick up from there? Because
Please.
I just had a conversation with Nadia Mohajir, who is the founder of Heart Women and Girls, which addresses sexual abuse, which addresses sex education in the community, etc., and does a lot of work and does trainings against sexual harassment and other things that are very community friendly as well, right? And we had a conversation about this, about how you would go about in a community addressing a problem that arose. So, for example, let's say she has various case studies in their trainings about things they've experienced. So somebody in the community, in a mosque community, say, for example, has a case of a Islamic teacher or something who is guilty, right? And then the first thing that's addressed is you go to the parents. What do they want, right? So if they're going to go with the carceral, with law enforcement, that's what you have to do. So you really, and of course, if it's a minor, you do have to do it anyway. You can't avoid that. But there are communities where people are saying, in other cases, minors are not concerned, we are going to handle this by ourselves. But you do need to have those structures and those mechanisms in place so that we can rehabilitate and offer some restorative justice. What does the legal system offer us? It offers us a sort of this, this what's the word? Litigious kind of system where the where the defendant is under pressure to say, I didn't do it. I'm not going to give you an apology because that would admit it, and then I would be under all this pressure. That's the system that we usually go to. And they will not say sorry, and they will not offer any whatever the survivors need, right? Whatever they need. And so that is what the defendant does offer is to the state. You will give like this much time to the state in prison, or you will, whatever fines. It all goes to the state. The survivors are actually not important in that system. That's terrible. Who needs that, right? How is that helpful, right? Not only that, but the survivor is going through a very harmful system also, because of that very conflictual kind of process that they go through. But if you had those systems in place, and some people have chosen to go through systems like that, there can be the possibility of rehabilitation. There can be the possibility of, people will go through communities, people training, etc., all those kinds of things. Usually when, so I'm actually talking about abolitionism and restorative justice and things like that. People's first question is, well, what about the rapists? Where are we going to put them, right? We have to lock them up, right? I don't know if anybody wants to touch that.
It doesn't really work.
Yeah,
that's exactly the thing. The current system doesn't actually
it doesn't work.
Restore, just and
recidivism. That's what you get. You just get the same.
But I mean, you're talking about at a state level.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Muslim communities. And of late, I haven't really been having my finger on the pulse with regards to all of these issues. But I've seen a few issues where prominent scholars in the Muslim community in North America as well as in Europe the finger has been pointed at them for alleged abuse. Yeah. And it's trial by Twitter.
Yes.
What they do is hide away. The proposed victims don't get any help from that. The scholar hides away. Whether they're guilty or not, they're cancelled from. So we have the same kind of system as that operates at state level, which we're applying now to Muslim communities.
And by the way, the survivor also goes through hell.
Precisely.
Everybody is talking about them, and even the people
they often
who think
don't
they're
have the resources.
helping, even the people who think they're helping, this person didn't consent to be part of your.
It becomes a proxy issue.
Exactly.
It becomes not actually about this. Yeah. But imagine if we had a system in place, right? Like a well-established system where instead of having to, why do people go to Twitter to begin with? Usually because nobody has heard them or there's no issue or whatever. If imagine there's a system in place, and my what I've seen, what I've observed, and this is not my area of expertise, Allahu Alam, but what I've seen anecdotally is that usually what survivors want is not state intervention. It's some kind of acknowledgement of pain, and they're trying to prevent this thing from happening to other people. Right? And I think it's in part because of that feel, especially when it's someone prominent and someone who's been very spiritually influential. It's in part, I think, motivated by this feeling of betrayal, right? That you've betrayed the trust of the community, that you're supposed to be someone who's bringing us all closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and here you are breaking these basic rules. So I think if we had a system in place, if we had different norms, and as someone who I organize in a lot of leftist non-Muslim spaces, a lot of those spaces have been grappling with the same thing and have been trying to institute some of these because again, those spaces are also very much not excited about dealing with the state or are against carcerality and all of these things. So I think that it's really, I can imagine some of those big things happening very differently. And I also think, again, within our tradition, we have a lot to draw on. But even Sayyidina Musa also has this moment, right, where he strikes a man, and he so I think we have a lot to draw on.
What the problem I'm having is that we have a lot to draw. We've mentioned some of the stories of the Prophet. Yeah. What does that look like when it comes to 2024 UK or USA? That we say we have a lot of in our tradition. Agreed. We have a lot of stories that we can draw on. Agreed. What do the actual mechanisms look like that would make that work, practically speaking? If I was to close my eyes and picture it in front of me, what would I see?
I think there's two issues here. I think there's one issue of abusing children from the position of authority as an imam, so on and so forth. And I think that has to be dealt with. And my response to the community is that if you feel that Islamophobes are going to kind of catch hold of this story, we need to look at the Catholic Church. I suppose it was the same kind of reasoning. Yes. We're going to hide this, people say, but now that has come out. And, I applaud the Catholic Church now, because now they're more committed to what are we going to do about the historic sexual abuse. So if you've watched, for instance, Spotlight, the movie What Happened, the Catholic Church intentionally was moving priests from one church once they did something to another church and then returned back to Vatican. We had the BBC Dark Corner looking at historic sexual abuse in Fettes and Gordeston, private schools in the 70s and 80s. Again, how these schools covered it up. And I think for Muslims this is very bad, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala inevitably where abuse takes place, it is going to come to light. And our response has to be that we, as committed Muslims, our job is not to hide it, but is actually to take the proper protocols and actually to address that. I think that's the issue when it comes to minor abuse. The second issue is where imams are in a position of power and they have done something wrong. How do we address that? So we've had imams, for instance, got caught sexting or something like that. The mechanisms to deal with that? We had a case in UK, a very professional one, where the prominent imams came and said to the imam, you need to be removed from that position of authority. The mosque came out and said, we're going to fire you. And I think as a non-Muslim onlooker, you'd be thinking, wow, Muslims actually are taking stuff seriously. If this happens, this is the way to actually deal with that. So I think there's kind of two issues here. One is abuse to minors, which is, and then it's, as an imam and authority, there's certain decorums we hold. And when we do not do that, how do you then respond to that?
Now, the passing of teachers or preachers from mosque to mosque also happens. Like how you're talking about in the Catholic Church as well. So rehabilitation happens no matter whether they've done admitted anything or paid for their crimes or not. They still immediately return to very often to their careers.
In terms of answering the question of what does that look like? Let's imagine, for example, that every masjid has a sort of a council of people from across the community that are tasked with being the sort of people that you come to with these questions, right? Yes. And they have an established protocol of if you come to us with an example of minor abuse, maybe that's that we call this, we report it, and that person is immediately immediately we tell the community, and that person is removed from whatever position of power. Other less kind of egregious examples, we have a protocol where this is what we do to investigate, right? We do this to investigate the question. We bring the parties together. We ask the parties, what would you like as restitution, right? We ask each party. There's all kinds of protocols that can be instituted, right? And then we have maybe a set of, we have a third party mediator that's involved. All of these things, there's precedent for them, not just in our community, but in general. These things are being developed, and I think we just need to take them on, reformulate them for what works for our community.
How do you understand? The problem is because the imam space is unregulated. Yes. So I am a counsellor, I'm registered with BACP, and we have to adhere with the ethics of BACP. And it's interesting because a lot of people say you shouldn't be alone with the woman, the third of the shaitan. Yeah. I've been alone with women clients most of my time of practicing, but I adhere to the principles. What is it that the imam cannot adhere to? If a counsellor can adhere to certain principles. The second thing is, if anything happens in this counselling space, they report back to BACP, BACP investigate, and I could potentially have a license because it's well regulated. The imam space is not regulated. It is just not regulated.
So I think what you're talking about is really important, and this is also something that one of my interviewees was Nadia, and I spoke to her about this, and they have actually lots of content and actually strategies in place. You can call them up and tell them, we have this problem just happened. They can come in, they can advise you exactly how it would work for you. So there are people like this now, just like the presenters here, you have people in the UK as well who are doing this sort of thing and can advise people on how to kind of address the restitution issue, the other things. Now, one of the issues that sometimes arises in that is that, say, for example, a Quran teacher who is accused of, abusing a minor or something, you can't teach Quran anymore. And then some people in the community will say, well, what is he supposed to do, right? Well, you can find other work, but this is not something for you.
One question here, if as a counsellor or as a pastoral worker or someone in that position, as a doctor, a medical doctor, as a they all have regulations and these frameworks in place. Now, you suggested something for the imam. Is not the position of the imam or the sheikh as also giving jurisprudential guidance on one hand, or giving the Quranic teachings on the other hand, or recitation of the Quran, as someone that the community is looking for as a spiritual icon? Do we want to mar that with regulatory frameworks, or that detract from that position? So at the beginning I was talking about over pedestalizing and that being a problem. At the same time, there's a spiritual aura around this position. Is that not something sacred that we want to hang on to? And is it spoiled by...
Literally in our history, though, that all people have been held accountable, even, the khulafa, like all of our great, spiritual leaders would always be held accountable. And that's something that we look to in pride, right? This woman yells at the Khalifa and says, why are you doing this? And I think that's really our thing. I feel like that's something I'm really proud of, that we don't have that sort of hero worship. We do have it, of course. Of course we do have it in our communities. And I think there's something to be examined psychologically there as well, in how people invest all of their faith and identity into the figure of this person, right? That if this person falls, it will take everything with it. And I think that is a trauma issue, and I think that people can guide that community and assist that community.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think part of what we're kind of circling around is that we're also operating under capitalism, in which people, this is a profession for some people, but I think the case is such that, and whether we want that to be true or not, it is true. And I think the case is that in many mosques, for example, the imam or the imam at least is employed by the community. And yes, we want that person to have an aura or whatever, but I think that's why I think masajid need to have a kind of secular board or secular council. And I think it shouldn't be the one uncle, right? Or 2-3 uncles. It should actually be an elected board of people, and they should have a protocol for how do we address if this person is. And so I don't want to see regulation I wouldn't advocate for the level of regulation that might be there for counselors, right? But certainly I think anyone who holds a position of power in a community should have some kind of counterbalance. And ideally that counterbalance isn't just one person, but is some kind of representative community board, right, that can...
Which changes
regularly, which is subject to election, which is not actually, which includes lay people, and in fact should be, which includes women. It needs to be said, that has the ability to at least sit and discuss, that has some kind of protocol to be able to sit and say, okay, we have gotten this complaint. Do we want to, what are we going to do about it?
Yeah, I think not reacting to it, but having the protocol in place is really...
I think the counseling were so to regulation, because if you looked at the history of Freud and even after his psychotherapists, there was a lot of sexual abuse from clients. Oh my goodness, there was a lot. So the regulation then actually that came out was very, very tough.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, you're right. We don't want imams to be regulated, but I don't know if we see more stories come out, more things. Is this what people are going to ask for? That needs to be done. I mean, for me, I would go. I'll again go back to our pedagogy, like the alamiya or the madrasa. We're taught books of fiqh and usul, but we've got this pastoral imam capacity. Are we also taught what are the kind of boundaries that actually we're working with? I don't think so. We're actually is taught that in the imam profession. So yeah, I think that's important. I think there's one more thing I'd like to address. I mean, I am from a Sufi tradition, but I think in the tariqa system there is a greater propensity of abuse.
Yeah.
Because as a murid, the idea is that you're suspending some level of self-agency, the sheikh. and that makes it, that makes it. And we all know stories in the Tariqah movements when there's been abuse, and I find that much.
I mean,
more
I spoke about that, right, in my paper as well. That even though I am also of a Sufi, I'm in a tariqah as well, but I have seen some things from people, and it's very harmful, and it's very difficult for them to get help because the sheikh is, in the Sufi tariqah, the sheikh isn't an imam. The sheikh is much more than, right? And so there is the unquestioning obedience. Really lays it open to so much abuse.
What's been mentioned about restorative justice, we mentioned earlier on, it kind of, and helping whether it's sexual abuse or other kinds of abuse, helping the abuser as well rehabilitate, kind of requires us to separate the person from what they've done. And on the flip side, I found it difficult, and I've heard it yesterday and also today, that once someone's fallen from grace, I can't stand the sight of them anymore. But actually, I'm not going to mention any names, but off social media and off lectures I've been hearing from some scholars who have talked about the Quran in certain ways and have really benefited. And suddenly I find that, these allegations are against them. But I'm still going to go back to those lectures because I really, really enjoyed what they were talking about. So it's really difficult to then, and for us who are neither victims nor abusers, to then look at these two individuals and say, well, I'm still going to benefit from this, or this is still a horrible thing to do. And maybe that objectivity is one channel through which these mechanisms can...
I think that it's about a question of power, right? So I think people need to fall from positions of power if they have been shown to abuse that power, right? But to me, it's like, I don't think there's anything wrong with, like, you go back to that lecture and, like, we know that, like, someone, you can have, what's that saying, where you can take the truth from anyone, right? Like, anybody could have a moment of, none of us are perfect, right? And I was joking that, in academia, it's like, we all know the feeling of, like, you read one paper that someone wrote, you're like, this is brilliant. And then the next paper they wrote, you're like, what the, and it's like, okay, I'm evaluating the argument or the whatever. So to me, it's about, I think the intervention needs to happen around power and maintaining the social relationship that enables abuse. But I think we can divorce other things from that.
So you can go to the lecture, but don't invite them to the mosque.
But then again, I mean, like, if you're talking about sociology, philosophy, as a particular lecture is done for abuse or anything, you can go back to those lectures. But there's something about religious discourse that it's it is difficult to then go back and just process if the sheikh's talking about something about the Quran. It's just different from other subjects.
I agree with you. It is really difficult. Because you opening your heart when you go to your religious spiritual sources, and how your heart doesn't open then, will that like corrode your spirituals? There's all kinds of things happening there.
From, again, a lot of the research, but from Maria, a lot of these people have then moved away from Islam, and the ramifications of it is... part of the slides, some of these people are revolted with men with beards. It's just the consequence and you're dealing with.
I was talking to somebody and they were saying that just praying, like your prayer was like conversion therapy, because somebody was doing this and telling them to feel differently, start feeling differently. And like they kept trying and praying and praying and praying, and they couldn't feel differently. And it was just like this horrible self-loathing that came with that.
We've explored a lot of issues within this, and of course it's a very heavy and difficult topic to deal with. We're not going to find the solution here between the four of us, but if anyone has any concluding remarks of what we can take away, then that'll help. that might help the audience a little bit.
I mean, from a practical point of view, I think all imams need to be like PVG checked. I don't think so. I think there has to be some sort of segregation between teaching girls and boys. But although there's imams been caught who've been abusing young boys
as well.
as well. But I still feel...
I mean, there's a strong tradition back home
of course. Yeah, absolutely. but there has to be certain... and then the spaces have to be quite, open, kind of public. You need to have maybe a teacher, but then someone who's there who's kind of checking. I think these are some practical aspects that every mosque should be doing. Like, I mean, a lot of this abuse that perhaps that's happened, not something much more historical, but the last 5 years, basic questions to the mosque. Did you PVG check the imam? Did you get some references? Not in Harry what? We actually had a professor in physics who was sexually abusing his students. And the thing is, he had come from Strathclyde University, and our university didn't do diligent checks from him. And our academic registrar had to resign because of that, because of the diligent checks. So even before the abuses happened, have checks actually been made? Right. So I think that's very minimum that we really should be working on.
That's so important, like checking references, making sure that there isn't, because people will pass on the problem, because it doesn't force them to take a stand. They don't have to be the bad guys that just pass you on to a different community. That's really just like terrible, just terrible ethics, terrible religious ethics. Yeah.
I think that draws a close to our third podcast in this series of 3 from Muslim engagement with gender and sexuality. And we hope the audience has benefited and feedback to us some of their thoughts on this podcast as well. And hopefully in the future we'll see more of Al-Mahdi Institute and the Center of Intra-Muslim Studies coming out with more of these very topical discussions.